last thing before we're done here is the War of 1812. Now, you'll remember that there was a war between the British and the French that eventually becomes the Napoleonic Wars. And the Napoleonic Wars embroil the continent of Europe. And what happens is that the great strength of the French is their army, and the great strength of the British is their navy. And the problem is that you can't defeat an army with a navy, and you can't defeat a navy with an army, right? And so what ends up happening is that this war in Europe becomes a stalemate, that the French control the continent of Europe, and that the British control the seas. So the British establish a blockade around Europe and say nobody can trade with France or anybody on the continent of Europe, okay? And then Napoleon says nobody on the continent of Europe can trade with anybody not on the continent of Europe, okay? Well, who's anybody?
Americans.
The United States. Remember, the United States is a trading country. And if you'll recall from Washington's farewell address, Washington had said, we don't really care about what's going on in Europe, but we insist on the right to trade with whoever we want. So we have both the French and the British trying to keep the Americans from trading, right? The difference is that the French fleet was destroyed in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. And so the British control the seas, and what will happen is that the British will start to what they call impress American sailors. They'll interdict American commerce on the seas, and they'll impress American sailors. And impressment doesn't mean, look how big our guns are, aren't you impressed, right? It means that they're forced into service. And what the British are going to say is that Americans aren't really Americans, they're really British. And because they're really British, they can be forced into service, okay? And so what will happen is that the British will seize the American goods, and they'll take the American sailors and send them to East Asia. So if you ever heard the phrase, I've been Shanghaied, right? But that's what it means, that Americans would be sent to Shanghai. And the reason why was because it was so far away, they would never be able to come back, right? Okay, so this is going to present an enormous challenge to the United States, because the United States really doesn't have a military. It doesn't have a navy. It has a navy, but it's not very big, right? It's nothing compared to the British Navy. But the American economy is suffering. Okay, so now one of the ways that that the Jefferson administration is going to try to, what's what I'm looking for? One of the ways that the Jefferson administration is going to try to end this intervention is by declaring an embargo, a non-importation act. The idea essentially that we're not going to import anything from Britain, and then later he's going to pass what's known as the Embargo Act, which is basically we're not going to trade. But the problem, of course, with that is that American economy depends heavily on trade. Even in the South, where they grow cotton, they need trade in order to be able to sell their cotton, right? And so this is going to be a very unpopular move, and it really doesn't affect the British at all. And eventually, then Jefferson will leave office after 2 terms, following the precedent set by Washington, and his Secretary of State Madison will become the next president, and he'll repeal all these acts. The problem is that these acts didn't really have any effect on the British intervention in American commerce. And so by 1811, Congress is going to just like it says here on the slide, is going to authorize a military buildup. And then in 1812, the United States declares war on Britain. Okay, now here's what we're going to know, that you may have heard the phrase before, hawks and doves. Okay, hawks and doves was big in the dialogue of the 1960s when they were talking about the war in Vietnam, because the hawks were the ones who were in favor of the war, the doves were the ones who were against the war, right? And here we see that this is where that term really comes from. The people who are in favor of the war, called war hawks, right? And they're going to be mostly Southerners and Westerners, right? Why? Because they see the war with Britain as an opportunity to gain territory. You guys get what I'm saying? Okay, the Federalists and people in the Northeast are going to be against the war. Why? Well, mostly because they depend on their trade with Britain. Okay, so we see then that that even though the United States has declared war, part of the United States is really against the war. Okay, you guys follow me here? All right, so now here's what's going to happen. When the war starts, it's going to go badly for the United States, obviously, from the very beginning, right? But then there's going to be some activity in the West where the British are going to be stressed. They're actually going to be you're going to be losing the war. Let's put it that way, right? And the result of that then is that the people in New England, the states in New England, are going to be concerned that the British are losing the war because they're still trading with the British over the Canadian border. You follow me here? All right, so they were not only traders, but they also may have been traitors, right? Because they wanted to continue that trade. And they were afraid that if the Americans were able to take Canada, that would end their trade with Britain. You follow me here? And so what happens is that the governments of these New England states decide to pull their troops out of the war. Now, the reason why this may seem odd is because during this period, the U.S. military wasn't like it is now. It wasn't like a centralized military made up of people from all over the place. It was a military that was hobbled together by troops sent from the different states. So at the beginning of the war, the federal government says, okay, Connecticut, you got to send this many troops. Massachusetts, you got to send this many troops. And then they would put them together. It's the same way it was in the Civil War too, right? The idea that each of the states had their own army under their own command. And that was why during the War of 1812, the New England states could pull their troops out of the war. And they went so far as to negotiate a separate peace, right? And they came together at a place called Hartford, Connecticut. There was a convention at Hartford, and they said that if the United States didn't make peace with Britain, that they were going to secede from the Union. Wait a minute. When we think about secession, what states do we think about? Do we think about Massachusetts seceding from the Union? What states do we think about?
The South.
The South, exactly. But here, the very first threat of secession comes from the Northeast. And what does this tell us? It tells us that question of whether or not the states can leave the Union is still open. It's an open question. What's the answer to the question? Well, the crisis here is going to pass. So New England doesn't try to secede from the Union at this point. But we see this as one of the options that many states still think is legal. Why do they think it's legal? What does the Constitution say about secession?
Nothing.
Exactly. Now, remember when we talked about Constitutional Convention, and we said that certain things were left unresolved. Why would the Constitution say nothing about secession? When the Constitution was written, certain things were left unstated. And why were they left unstated? What would have happened if they had said, okay, no states can secede from the Union? And if you're from a state that is very jealous of your state authority, would you be likely to go along with that?
No.
No.
No. Okay. But now, if you're from a state that thinks that the Union is actually creating a bigger country, uh, and the Constitution said, well, anybody can leave the Union if they want, would they go along with that? No. Okay. So if they decided one way or the other, what would have happened to their ability to agree on the Constitution?
There wouldn't have been an agreement.
There wouldn't have been an agreement. Okay. So certain things, particularly these two things, were left unstated. The supremacy of the federal government and whether or not the states can leave the Union. Okay. They were left unstated because if they had tried to define it, then they would not have been able to agree. Okay. But the problem, I mean, that means that the Constitution is put into effect. But the problem is that those questions remain. And we're seeing it here now in 1813, where New England political leaders are saying, well, we can secede from the Union, right? Well, what says they can't? Nothing says they can't. You guys get what I'm saying? All right. So at any rate, the point here then is that this is a question that's going to continue to haunt the United States until the Civil War. The Civil War will effectively end it, although the argument is still being made. And in fact, I read this morning that several attorneys general of Republican states are suing the Biden administration in court over the COVID relief plan, saying that the COVID relief plan violates the rights of the state. Okay, so we'll see how that plays out. But at any rate, the point is it's something they still argue about even today, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments? Okay, well, here's what happens. Almost done here, guys. Here's what happens is that in 1814 is a bad year for the United States. Britain is going to invade Virginia and Maryland. And in fact, they'll land troops and they'll burn the White House, right? So when President Trump accused Justin Trudeau of burning the White House, he was only off by a little bit because it wasn't the Canadians, it was the British. But at any rate, the White House will be burned, and then there'll be a large fleet that will be sent to take Baltimore. But there's a fort outside of Baltimore called Fort McHenry, and that fort had to be taken in order to be able to land troops in Baltimore. And then what happens is that the British are going to bombard that fort throughout one night. And it so happens that the people of Baltimore have made a huge flag, a huge American flag, that they're flying over the fort at Fort McHenry. And the bombardment lasts all night. And from the deck of one of the British ships, there's going to be an American doctor named Francis Scott Key, who is actually watching all night long. And in the morning, the flag is still flying and the British are going to withdraw. Okay. And so Francis Scott Key writes a poem about the battle. Does anybody want to try and guess what that poem's name is?
Star Spangled Banner.
The Star Spangled Banner, right? Oh, say does that Star Spangled Banner yet wave, right? All right, so when you go to the baseball game or the hockey game or whatever you go to and they start singing the national anthem at the beginning, they're singing about this battle, all right? Because later what will happen is that they'll take the verses of Francis Scott Key's poem and put it to the tune of a Scottish drinking ballad, and it'll become the American national anthem. At any rate, so at any rate, the Americans, the British withdraw, but there's going to be another battle that happens down here in New Orleans. But now let me just mention what's important about 1814. 1814 is the year that Napoleon was finally defeated. Okay, which means that now there's no longer a war between Britain and France. And the only reason why the United States was in the war with Britain was over the war between Britain and France and whether or not the United States could trade. You guys follow me here? And the British don't want to, the British want to resume trading with the Americans because they're making money off of it, right? And so the British, when Napoleon is defeated, the British decide to call off the war, essentially, right? And they'll negotiate a treaty at a place called Ghent in Holland, right? And the treaty will return the situation between the United States and Britain to the way it was before. They call it the status quo ante, the way it was before, meaning that the United States doesn't win anything, but they don't lose anything. You guys follow what I'm saying? That's essentially the outcome. The outcome is that the United States doesn't win anything, but it doesn't lose anything, okay? But now what's going to happen, that treaty is actually signed on Christmas Eve in 1814. There's going to be a battle here in December of it ends up happening in January of 1815, right? It's called the Battle of New Orleans. You probably have heard of it, right? There's an American militia general from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson, and he's going to lead a kind of a ragtag army of militiamen and pirates and slaves and people like that against a well-organized British army, and the Americans will win that battle. And the battle happens in January of 1815. So keep in mind then that the Battle of New Orleans happens after the war is already officially over, because the treaty was signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. You guys follow me here? So essentially the United States really is no longer at war. They just don't know it yet. All right, you guys follow me here? But because of the great distances involved, Americans in the East are going to learn about the Battle of New Orleans before they learn about the Treaty of Ghent. So from the point of view of the Americans, they hear Andrew Jackson has won this great battle in New Orleans. And the next thing then is that we've got a treaty and we didn't lose. So Americans are going to say, well, we won. Andrew Jackson won the war for us, right? And the Americans then will claim victory. And to this day, actually, most people will, if you hear people talking about the War of 1812, they'll say the Americans won. The reality is that the Americans didn't lose. That's the best they can say. They can't say they actually won. They didn't gain anything, right? The reason why so many people supported the war was that they were going to be able to get Canada. But they didn't get Canada. They didn't get anything, right? And so there was a real fear on the part of the president that Americans would be against the treaty because they didn't gain anything. But because of Andrew Jackson's victory, Americans believed they had won. And what's going to follow is this era of super patriotism. It's called the era of good feelings, right? And the era of good feelings is what we're going to talk about after we come back from spring break.